Hi, everybody. My name is Jeannie Rosner. Welcome. You are at Soul Food Salon. And let me tell you a little bit about me and Soul Food Salon, and then we'll get started with today's event. So I'm a retired pediatric anesthesiologist, and I now teach nutrition and health and wellness classes in our local middle and high schools. And I started Soul Food Salon in about 2014. My hope and mission is to educate and empower us all to be healthier. We hold monthly events. They were historically in person, where we alternated between a talk and a cooking event. And since COVID, we've been doing them virtually. However, now that things are evolving, who knows what will be next. We're excited. We have a website, soulfoodsalon.com. Check it out. Everything we've done in the past 7+ years is there. Our past events, our past presentations, anything that we've written, recipes, etc. Everything is there. So take a look at it. You can spend a lot of time and learn a lot there. I'm very active on social media, mainly through Instagram, and my handle is @SoulFoodSalon. So follow along and share that with other people. My hope, again, is to educate and empower others to be healthier and all of us to be healthier. I present the leading science. I present a lot of recipes, and I'm hoping to inspire us all to be healthier. Each year we partner with a different nonprofit, and this year we are partnered with Off Their Plate. Off Their Plate is a fully volunteer-run organization that started a year ago, right when COVID started, by a third-year medical student at Harvard Medical Center. She saw that the cafeterias were closed in her hospitals, and she saw the restaurants that were closing in her area as well. And what she did was she married and partnered the two together, where she kept the restaurants afloat by them providing meals to the hospital workers. They're now present in 11 major cities. They're present here in the Bay Area, and that's the effort that we are supporting. So far, we've raised over $17,000, and thank you to everybody that has made a donation. I am so grateful. I would love it if those that are here today could perhaps make a donation. So essentially, a $100 donation provides compensation to the restaurant workers for 3 work hours, and it provides 10 meals to the at-need community. So you can go on my website, soulfoodsalon.com, and in the middle of the main page, the About page, there's a little blurb about Off Their Plate, and there's a distinct link that Off Their Plate created for Soul Food Salon for donations. So please, if you feel so inclined, click that donate button and make any amount donation that you desire. So our next salon is going to be at this point in September, and it's going to be a cooking event, and it's going to be featuring Linda Shu, who is an MD. She's an internist, and she's a chef, and she's actually the organizer behind the Thrive Teaching Kitchen at Kaiser Permanente in San Francisco. She cooks a lot with spices. She actually has a new cookbook that just came out called Spice Box Kitchen, and her event is going to be something like cooking in the kitchen with spices. And we're hoping that that will be a live event, and we're hoping perhaps I can do some kind of hybrid with a virtual concept with the live event. Stay tuned on that. And so today's event is totally virtual, as you can see. Dr. Mayer will do his presentation, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. I will not interrupt him during the presentation, but just type in whatever questions that you have in the question box, and we'll do our best to address those questions. So let me introduce Dr. Mayer. He is a gastroenterologist, a neuroscientist, and a leading researcher. He's from UCLA Medical Center, and he's a leading researcher in the area of the mind-brain-body connection and how it connects with health and chronic disease. He is the author of 2 books, The Mind-Gut Connection, and most recently, which is coming out in June, The Mind-Gut Immune Connection, which I just received this a few days ago. I'm knee deep in it, and I love it. So I met Dr. Mayer at a nutrition conference about 5 years ago. He gave a riveting presentation, and afterward I went up and started talking with him, and we rode the escalator together, and we've been in touch ever since. And he's just a genuinely kind, smart, just unbelievable man, and I am so grateful that he's here today, and I'm grateful that you all get to learn from him. So I'm gonna let him take over.
Thanks, Jean, for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's really nice to reconnect. with this event, from our initial encounter at a meeting in Boston. And so I'm gonna share my screen. Just a couple of words. So I have a career-long interest in studying and seeing patients with problems related to brain-gut interactions long before microbiome science really turbocharged this area. And the interest has really, over the years, this has been a fringe area within gastroenterology, but has taken center stage now, both in terms of lay media, scientific interest, and has created a worldwide interest in terms of how the microbes living in our gut, the gut microbiome, how they connect with us, the host, both with our brain and with our immune system. And it's on its way to revolutionize really the way we think about health and disease in many areas. So this was a PowerPoint, a slide that I shared promoting my first book, The Mind-Gut Connection, which dealt with some of these topics here: optimal health, gut reactions, gut feelings, emotions, early memories, but it also dealt with the important role of the diet in this brain-gut, what I will call from now on the brain-gut microbiome system. And I'll explain to you why I prefer system to axis in just a minute. So this is the way we conceptualize today how the brain, the gut, and the environment interact with each other. This looks fairly complicated. It is complicated. I just want to emphasize, it's not a linear relationship that what happens in the gut is reflected in the brain. It's a system of bidirectional communication pathways that link all these players, including the immune system, as you can see in the middle, together. Like any system, so there's a field now called systems biology. Any system can be perturbed, and it has a certain resilience to these perturbations. It doesn't fall apart. It keeps functioning. But we can use the perturbations to understand the property of the system. So two major perturbations, which we call, in general language, stressors. One is psychosocial stress that is targeted at the brain, and it is mirrored in all the other aspects of that system, the immune system and the gut microbiome. And then there's also something that normally we don't refer to as stress, but it is the same concept, a perturbation by our diet. So the diet has become a major stressor for this system. And what we also know, and I'll convince you throughout my talk, it's the interaction, the simultaneous experience of both of these stressors that is responsible for many of the problems, the health problems that we see today in form of really a chronic non-infectious disease epidemic, manifesting as cardiovascular disease, cancer, some forms of cancer, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and many other diseases that we normally don't link together in medicine as being related to this particular system that I'm showing you here. So let me step back and give you sort of a very brief 101 course on the microbiome. So we've long known that individual species, strains of microbes can influence behavior. A classic example is this life cycle of Toxoplasma gondii, a parasite that requires a transition from the host, the cat, to rodents. The rodents have to be eaten by the cat in order to maintain this life cycle. And one obstacle to this life cycle is obviously that mice and rats are afraid of cats, so they have this innate fear response. And what this organism does, it gets into the brain of the infected mouse, and shuts off the stress system in a very sophisticated way, and actually switches this to another system that is the opposite, this affiliative system that plays a role in affiliation and even sexual attraction. So now all of a sudden, the mouse feels attracted to the cat because this one microbe, this one parasite, knows so much about the brain of the rat that is able to selectively turns off these basic stress circuits within the mouse. There's many examples of how parasites have this amazing knowledge of our human brain, and which assures that they survive and can multiply. But that's not really what we talk about when we talk about the microbiome. The microbiome is a very complex system, and it's also something that, even though it's located in the gut, whatever happens in the microbiome or in the gut doesn't stay there. It goes way beyond this defined space of our intestinal tract, and I'll illustrate this here in a moment. I should say, probably many people know this by now, that we have about 40 trillion of these microbes living in our gut, invisible. They live in a space without oxygen. They actually don't like oxygen. They thrive in this oxygen-free space, which is dark. They're invisible. So it's not surprising that it took us a long time to really, for science to focus on this sort of life form that has been living with us for millions of years. So when I say it doesn't, what happens in the gut microbiome doesn't stay there, shows you a few of these connections. I will get into more detail throughout this talk. An important one is the immune system. 70% of our immune system is located in the gut, just separated by microns from these trillions of microbial organisms. But nevertheless, many of these microbes interact with immune cells, such as the dendritic cells or T lymphocytes, subtypes of T lymphocytes in the gut, and they generally in health have a positive effect. So for example, I'll give you just one example. By interacting with a particular type of T cell, they produce an anti-inflammatory substance, interleukin 10, which keeps control of any inflammation in the gut. So it's a homeostatic mechanism by which gut microbes contribute to a healthy gut. But also, as we have learned, there's interactions of microbes with the same kind of dendritic cells. These are these sentinels really in our gut microbiome. And if these cells are hyper-responsive, they will trigger a immune response that should not happen against many foods that we used to be able to eat without any problems. Peanut allergies, something like this didn't exist really. When I went to medical school, and when it first appeared, people were skeptical, physicians were skeptical, is this something imagined or real? But we know in the meantime, it has to do with the interactions of microbes early on in life, training our immune system to recognize good and bad things that we ingest. And if that training in early life goes wrong, then we are stuck with an allergy from now on that the immune system attacks or hyperreacts whenever we are exposed to this agent. We also now know that other organs are affected by molecules produced, both molecules and cell wall components of these microbes. For example, this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the most common form of chronic liver disease now and of cause of cirrhosis, we know now is related to activations or pathways that connect the microbiome and diet with this pathology. We also know important consequences for cardiovascular disease, and that there are multiple ways that this happens. One is a chemical that microbes produce and then which is converted in the liver, this TMAO molecule. That is a factor that is equally a risk factor to developing cardiovascular disease as hypertension or high cholesterol is. And then finally, the interactions with the brain, something that I've been particularly interested in, that the immune activation that happens in the gut, the interactions between microbes and the immune system is transmitted all the way to immune cells within the brain, these microglial cells. And it affects the blood-brain barrier integrity, but also it leads to neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration. So a big effort now is on studying this mechanism in neurodegenerative diseases like cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, and also Parkinson's disease. So this is just a sample of the most studied targets of a dysregulated gut microbiome system, the gut itself with inflammatory bowel diseases, but also with colon cancer, food allergies, chronic liver disease, chronic heart disease, and these neurodegenerative brain diseases. So I'll come back to this, what the burden of these, when these interactions go wrong, what the burden on our health and the healthcare system is that comes from these interactions. So microbes have been with us, or our, the origins of mammalian organisms for a long time. For 3.5 billion years, it was the dominant life form in the oceans. So there was a lot of time that these microbes were able to develop communication systems between each other, develop defense mechanisms against more aggressive microbes, and have stored all this information that was gathered over, and in this intelligence, 3.5 billion years, in their gene pool. About 500 million years ago, so relatively short time ago, these primitive marine animals evolved, the hydra, tiny little floating digestive tubes, as you can see, with an opening, a mouth, and an end to the GI tract. And they would basically just filter water with nutrients through this digestive tube and extract nutrients. But what's most interesting about this is that they had these nerve nets surrounding this digestive tube. And these nerve nets basically were able to program the contractions and also the movement of these primitive animals. And then at some point, certain microorganisms from these trillions of microorganisms in the oceans ended up inside the in these floating digestive tubes, and a symbiosis developed between these microorganisms and these animals, particularly with their nerve nets. So this was, fast forward, these nerve nets, we still have those surrounding our gut. They're now the enteric nervous system, or what's been called the little brain of the gut. And we still have the interactions of certain microbes with that nerve net that ultimately were the precursors for the development of our human brain. This is a whole story, exciting. I've dealt with it in my first book, that many of the molecules that these microbes have developed over billions of years are actually ending up in our brain as neurotransmitters, the same molecules, the same receptors. And that explains why there's such an intricate relationship between the two most unusual life forms, microbes in our gut, and this most sophisticated computer in our brain. What we understood about microbes when I went to medical school was that they basically are able to break down complex carbohydrates like resistant starch or lignans or other components of plant-based foods into smaller molecules. Like, I just want to emphasize this one, short chain fatty acids, which is sort of a currency that these microbes use to communicate in a beneficial way with all aspects of gut physiology and our health. And also a very important function, these microbes have mechanisms based on their vast gene pool to deal and process molecules such as drugs or toxins that they've actually never seen in evolution, but they're able to come up with a solution to break them down into metabolites that are then can be absorbed or excreted. So fast forward from this understanding of the microbes in our gut from a metabolite generation system into a system-wide communication system. So now we know, as I showed on the first slide, on the previous slide, the interactions with every organ system in our body, with the immune system, the cardiovascular system, the little brain of the gut, with which they're most familiar because this has been going on for hundreds of millions of years, with the stress axis and brain and behavior. So we've gone from a sort of a biochemical understanding to a intelligence and system understanding of the gut microbiome. So in the middle of this slide, schematically, you can see the complexity. These are all the molecules that microbes can generate, can produce hundreds of thousands of different, what we call metabolites. And one important source for these metabolites is the food that we ingest. I'm illustrating this here with the diet that is optimal for microbial health and for the most diverse production of these molecules. There's tens of thousands of so-called phytochemicals in plant-based foods that are the basis for these metabolites and that ultimately have a benefit for us. These metabolites, once they're generated, then are distributed throughout our body. The first station is the immune system, and a very important target is the brain. So we're just at the moment, at the beginning, we've identified quite a few of these individual molecules, but to understand that whole, what's called a metabolome, and how these individual metabolites interact to produce health and disease, we're still a long ways away. And I mentioned earlier, so 3.5 billion years was a long time for microbes to collect and develop their communication system. And this has generated a very large number of genes where this information is stored. It's been estimated between 2 and 20 million microbial genes compared to our meek 20,000 human genes. This is kind of represented here. So the red outline quantitatively would be our human genes. The rest, the white content of this figure are the microbial genes. So in all our conceptualization of health and disease in our textbooks and our therapies, we essentially neglect 99% of that system, the information that is that we have inside of us. And we're not only neglecting it, but we also do not know what the system does, what information is contained. We're just scraping at the surface of a very a universe of information that will ultimately be able to harness for diagnosing, treating, and understanding chronic human diseases. This microbiome system is not stable over a lifetime. It's programmed early in life, first 2 to 3 years in life, where the microbial communities develop and populated this ecosystem. Major influences during that time starts in utero, so the diet of the mother, the health of the mother, infections, chronic diseases, but also stress of the mother. All of this has been shown largely in animal models, but some studies also have shown the same thing in humans, influence the development of the gut microbiome of the infant, in addition to the mode of delivery, the mode of delivery determines a lot of how fast the infant microbiome, the infant gut is colonized by the normal microbes, and also what they're being fed early on, not just what the mother has been eating, the diet, which informs this development of the infant's gut microbiome, but also what the developing microbiome of the infant is getting, being formula fed or being breastfed. And then there's major insults, so major threats to this development, to this early training, which is massive doses of antibiotics. There's multiple doses that an infant, particularly newborn infants in the neonatal intensive care unit, are exposed to in the first year of life, certainly in the first 3 years of life. There's environmental factors that influence this, from what environment with pets or farm animals or other environmental factors that influence the infant's development. And there's clearly also genetics, but genetics play a smaller role in the microbiome than they do in mice and in some animals. Then later on in life, when this system becomes fairly stable, again, medications, foremost antibiotics, that play a big role in modifying the system or compromising it. Another major factor are influences from the brain, stress and negative emotions. And then maybe the most important influence is the diet, what we feed these microbes that are specialized on processing and metabolizing complex plant-based molecules. That's their natural nutrition. They thrive on that. Their diversity thrives on that. So if we change the diet, we will have a major impact. Even though it was programmed early on in life, there's still a major role for this later modification in adult life. And then there's a lot of interest now in what happens in later age, in 65 years and older, with healthy people, healthy octogenarians and people in their hundreds, have one type of microbiome composition, and others that have chronic diseases, which is almost like now, the rule in Western societies that is somehow compromised by diabetes and other metabolic diseases, have a distinctly different system. So the system is programmed early in life, and it can be modified as a natural course of evolution throughout life, and can be influenced in a major way, in a positive and a negative way, throughout life with these lifestyle factors that I mentioned. So I talked a lot in general terms of how this interaction between the microbiome and the organs happens, and I'll focus on the system that mediates this communication between the microbes and the brain. These microbial signals. Complicated slide, just have to pay attention to a few things here. So there's 3 sources of these signaling molecules that microbes produce. Many of them are diet derived, some are host derived, and some actually are related to the microbes themselves. So let me explain this briefly. In terms of diet, amino acids that we ingest with our diet, polysaccharides, complex sugar molecules that make up fiber in the natural, hundreds of different types of fibers, and then polyphenols, a group of molecules that has received a lot of attention in the past under the name of antioxidants, but there's a lot more to that story than being antioxidants. All of these in the 2 last category are very large molecules that cannot be absorbed in the human small intestine, so they travel down to the end of the intestine where the microbes live, and we need the microbes to break them down and uncover their hidden health benefits, both for the microbes themselves, they thrive on these molecules, but also they generate molecules that then enter our circulation. And you can ignore the middle part, the biochemical part, but the signals that come out of this, again, the short chain fatty acids, these health promoting anti-inflammatory molecules, neurotransmitters, and I'll give you a couple of examples of these that are neuroactive substances that can go directly to the brain and the enteric nervous system. Simple molecules generated from these polyphenols that can be absorbed and then can enter the circulation, some of which act as antioxidants, but they have many more functions which are being unraveled now. And so if you leave this group of diet-related metabolites, we go to the host-derived one, a very interesting topic in itself. So let me start with the bile acids. Everybody knows, we need bile acids to optimize our fat assimilation and absorption. They're produced in the liver, and they are excreted into the bile, stored in the gallbladder, and then excreted into the small intestine, at the end of the small intestine. And the microbes actually can modify. So these molecules are not just good for fat absorption, but the microbes break down these molecules into reabsorbable components that are then reabsorbed in the end of the small intestine or in the colon, get into our circulation as so-called secondary bile acids. And they have been found to play a major role in now many diseases. Some of these secondary bile acids are actually brain health promoting, but some have negative effects. And the ratio of negative to positive bile acids has now been identified as playing a role in such diverse diseases as autism spectrum and Alzheimer's disease and depression. And there's another fascinating story that estrogen hormones produced by the ovaries are modified in the liver. They're also excreted, just like the bile acids, into the small intestine. Specialized microbes can then further modify these estrogen molecules, and some of them into reabsorbable compounds. So depending on what microbes you have, what ecosystem you have, this will determine how much of the estrogens that are being secreted into the intestinal tract are being reabsorbed and then are available in the circulation and produce their physiological effects. For both of these mechanisms, not everybody has the same ecosystem of microbes that can do this well. So there's big inter-individual differences, and these differences may play a big role in chronic diseases. And then finally, this group of molecules, I would just draw attention to a group of molecules that are all derived from the membrane of microbes. So the walls of microbes broken down into smaller molecules, which can interact with the immune system. I'll show this to you in more detail. So group of molecules called lipopolysaccharides, or these group of microorganism associated molecular patterns. This pathway plays a big role in the immune connection. This pathway plays a big role in the modulation of systems in our body that that we've poorly understood in the past, that there was a big microbial factor here. And then these neurotransmitters and short-chain fatty acids that have already received a lot of attention in terms of gut health. Let me give you one example of these neurotransmitters, and don't pay attention to the details, and just give you the general idea. So tryptophan, an essential amino acid that we get that we ingest with nuts, cheese, many other foods that we are essential part of our diet. We don't produce tryptophan. Once it gets into our gut, microbes process this molecule So some of it is, a lot of it is absorbed, but what goes down to the microbial ecosystem is converted. It's first taken up by specialized cells in the gut wall, these enterochromaffin cells, the biggest storage site of serotonin in our body. 90% of all the serotonin is produced and stored here. And what we have learned the last couple of years is that the production of serotonin from tryptophan is actually regulated by microbes, again, by short-chain fatty acids and secondary bile acids that I mentioned before. So very unsuspected that this microbial ecosystem plays a big role in serotonin production, which then is serotonin signals to the brain, to many centers that regulate appetite and sleep and overall well-being through the vagus nerve and other nerve signals that form synapses with these specialized cells. This is just one way of how tryptophan gets into our system with the help of microbes. Another one, don't need to remember that name, is tryptophan is the good guy, kynurenine is the bad guy, plays a big role in neuroinflammation and neurotoxicity, has been identified in disease models like depression and Alzheimer's disease. Again, the microbes play a big role. So lactobacilli that produces hydrogen peroxide can inhibit the conversion of tryptophan into kynurenine. So the more lactobacilli you have in your gut, the more tryptophan is converted to serotonin. Under chronic stress, there's a decrease in the lactobacilli, and you have a greater conversion to kynurenine with the stress is chronic, with the implications for brain health. And then finally, possibly the most interesting one, so the indoles is the third metabolite group that can be produced by microbes. And as opposed to these first two, indoles can only be produced by microbes. So if you don't have microbes, you cannot generate these. Indoles play, again, a big role both in brain health, but also in brain diseases. So one particular breakdown product, this indoxyl sulfate, has now been identified to playing a major role in diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and autism spectrum disorders. So just the examples, 3 examples, they're all dependent on microbes, where microbes modulate the production and where microbes actually do the production. Any change in the microbial composition will influence these 3 groups of metabolites. Now just fast forward and imagine there's not just tryptophan, there's many other food-related compounds that are broken down in similar ways into other molecules that are important for our own health, gut health, and brain health. And these are just 3 mechanisms by which this could happen. There's probably many more and many more metabolites. So very complex system that we're beginning to understand at, it's very important and practical levels because we can influence. So stress reduction would essentially influence this system, and a diet high in tryptophan would influence this system, and a diet that largely plant-based that nurtures a healthy microbial ecosystem would influence all 3 of these conversions. So let me say a few words about gut microbiome immune interactions. I mentioned this a couple of times. Again, complex slide. I want to emphasize, like many systems in the body, there's beneficial effects and there's detrimental effects of microbes. If you look at the detrimental effects first, you can see the disease areas: neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, others, chronic inflammation. Inflammation comes up in all these areas because this is clearly one mechanism that we think now chronic systemic immune activation is a a cause for many of our most common diseases. And you can see that what also shows up is this group of membrane components of the microbes. So not what they produce, but actually what they consist of. And when this gets into contact with immune cells, leads to this sequel. So these MEMS, some microbial membrane components, show up in all of these, are common denominator. And then what happens in the brain, these negative influences can influence brain integrity, neuronal integrity, glial cell integrity, and also permeability of blood vessels in the brain that make up this blood-brain barrier. So now it's not just negative things that microbes do, there's a lot of positive things. In the healthy state, all these influences would exert a positive influence on the integrity of our brain, which is composed of nerve cells, neurons, and immune cells, microglial cells. And I just want to sort of highlight this again. What shows up in all of these are the short-chain fatty acids, the polyphenols, the tryptophan metabolites, some of these estrogen metabolites I told you that microbes can produce that are being reabsorbed. But it gives you sort of a general framework of which things exert a negative influence when they come in contact with immune cells, and which cells, which mechanisms like the short-chain fatty acids have been demonstrated now extensively in cells, in animal models, and some in humans exert a positive effect. Show you this again in a kind of simple cartoon-like fashion. The cell wall components of all these different microbes, the substances called lipopolysaccharide, flatulin, they're all part of the cell membrane, interact with particularly immune cells in the gut, which leads to stimulation of cytokines, these inflammatory signaling molecules, which can cross the blood-brain barrier, activate these glial cells in the brain, stimulates the glial cells to produce cytokines again, which affect neurons, nerve cells. And then ultimately the modification of these nerve cells will lead to neuroinflammation if it's chronic neurodegeneration. And this is probably the common denominator that leads to reduced cognitive function, depression, fatigue, and many other, this could also include the long COVID syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, many syndromes that we have either dismissed, like chronic fatigue syndrome, as not being a real biological syndrome, something that, is a psychological dimension. Unfortunately, this has sort of a lot of big portion of the medical system has kind of dismissed these, but also the long COVID. We have now explanations how this can actually start in the gut, and by a very well-characterized pathway can lead to symptoms that we previously have not really understood. So what happens in the gut, and how does diet, we talked about dietary stress, so how does diet relate to this immune activation? We first look at the healthy gut, trillions of microbes, the gut wall, and the immune system just underneath the gut wall. This is just microns separated from these microbial organisms. In a healthy gut, you have a healthy, thick mucus layer, which requires microbes to stimulate gut cells to produce this mucus. And then we have an intact gut barrier. There's no contact of the gut-based immune system with any of the microbes or their cell wall components. There's a few specialized immune cells that actually reach all the way into the mucus layer, these dendritic cells. But because there's a thick, insulating mucus layer, they also don't come into contact with the microbes themselves. So what happens in a leaky gut situation, which is something a common consequence of the standard American diet. But not only diet, but also chronic stress, and we'll come back to this. So the mucus layer shrinks in size and quality. All of a sudden now, microbes, these are not pathogens, these are your good guys living inside of your gut. They come into contact with these sensors of the dendritic cells. And as I showed you on the previous slide, then once these cells are activated, they produce cytokines that activate a cascade of immune cell changes in the gut-based immune system, which, if severe enough, can then compromise the barrier function between these gut epithelial cells. So now intact microbes can actually get all the way down into the immune system and into the systemic circulation. We get a situation called metabolic endotoxemia. So endotoxemia has been understood until recently as an infectious severe complication of a infection by a pathogen. But this is simply triggered not by a pathogen, it's simply triggered by poor diet, chronic stress, and the consequences on our gut immune system. And this low-grade immune activation, circulating immune mediators in our systemic circulation in the context of increased genetic risks of an individual is a major risk factor for any of those diseases listed down here. So just recapitulate this all can be restricted to the gut. So we have a low-grade inflammation of the gut, or after translocation of microbes into the immune system, you get this metabolic endotoxemia. The sad thing is the majority of people in the United States are on the standard American diet. A large proportion of people, it's been estimated up to 40% are in the obese / metabolic disease category. So a lot of people, probably 30% of individuals, seemingly healthy individuals, are affected by this metabolic endotoxemia, and if they have the genetic risks for it, can develop any of these diseases with greater likelihood, simply because something started with diet or with chronic stress. And this double whammy from chronic stress and an unhealthy diet has really developed over the last 75 years, and this summarized here, which has dramatically changed our lifestyle and our diet. And this has accelerated after World War II. It really, everybody was slim, nobody had metabolic syndrome, very low rate of obesity. And if you look at the numbers now, dramatic change. Another factor, these changes in the way humans come into this world, birth in hospitals, which is not a hospital environment for our microbes, full of antibiotics and a sterile environment, lack of exposure to natural microbe-containing sources like animals, and mixing of humans in tight spaces, exposure to the soil, and also the medical practices. So vaccination use, excessive antibiotic use, and the excessive hygiene. So hygiene has dramatically increased over the last year with the pandemic. It's a good thing. But we don't know, people have speculated what additional effect does this have on our gut microbes, with everything being wiped off microbes, fruits and vegetables, which are a source of exogenous microbes as well. So this has resulted in a chronic state of dysbiosis in a large number of people, probably reaching the majority of Americans. This dysbiosis means an altered composition of the gut microbial ecosystem. This has led, microbes are very adaptable, so they quickly adapt to this new environment. But the gut is not that adaptable. The gut is essentially determined by our 20,000 genes that change at the fastest every 15,000 years. So while the microbes have adapted rapidly and the gut has not, there's now a mismatch between the two, which leads to these disturbed interactions with the immune system and the immune activation. This has resulted in diseases, as I showed you before, and most of our organ systems. So the gut microbiome mediates the influence of stress on the immune system. I just showed you the example of dietary stress, give you an example of the other kind of stress, what we normally understand under stress, the brain-targeted or psychosocial stress. But this is just sort of summarizing this. We talked about the dietary stress affecting the gut-associated immune system. And I'll show you a couple of examples how the brain-targeted stress, the psychosocial stress, can lead to the same consequence, because this closely interconnected system, what happens in one corner doesn't stay in that corner. It affects other components, and particularly the immune system. So psychosocial stress, we know a lot about this, what happens to the brain. We also know that many chronic emotional states are associated with stress, particularly anxiety, fear, anger, sadness. And a lot of work has been done on, and again, the stress doesn't stay and the emotions don't stay in the brain. They, through the brain-gut communication, affect what goes on in the gut. They can directly affect the microbes, these pathways. It's mainly the sympathetic nervous system. And as shown here, so the sympathetic nervous system is activated under any of these conditions. There's an increase in our blood of norepinephrine, the main stress mediator, which drives up our heart rate and our blood pressure. But it also leaks into the gut and interacts with receptors on the microbes, changing their gene expression pattern and their behavior. So now these stressed microbes interact with our gut in a different way, in a more aggressive way. And I told you this in the beginning, so because we have co-evolved our nervous system with the microbes, so they know these signaling molecules and the receptors, they're all homologs or similar molecules as we have in our brain or in our enteric nervous system. That's why this communication is possible and happens every time we produce something in our gut in response to a brain stimulus that the microbes understand and then respond to it. It's very true about serotonin, opioids, and many other signaling molecules. There's another thing that happens. This has been well studied over the years. The home or the habitat of the microbes changes under acute stress and probably also under chronic stress. So the contractions, intestinal transit time, intestinal fluid and mucus secretion, all the secretions that happen in our gut change under stress. The functions of these warehouses for serotonin, we talked about earlier, but also the barrier, the gut becomes more leaky, and ultimately, as a result, just like the bad diet, that it affects the gut-associated immune system. I should say, for both of these stresses, dietary and psychosocial stress, if you have a stressful experience once or for a couple of weeks, the damage is probably not that significant. But the bad thing is that in our society, these are chronic stressors that impact or negatively impact our brain-gut microbiome system and lead to these inappropriate immune activations throughout our system. Now, I should explain briefly this term allostatic load. So stress mechanisms, both in response to diet and in response to psychosocial stress are highly adaptive, which means they have evolved in evolution to protect our species, and they've saved our species many times from extinction, being able to run away from a dangerous animal, or surviving wars, or surviving starvation, are all examples of how perfect these systems are, but they have not evolved for chronic exposure to these stresses. So when we have a chronic exposure, it's referred to allostatic load. They get overwhelmed, stress systems, and then their effect on our body and the benefit changes to a disease liability. And many of us are exposed to this chronic allostatic load throughout our lives. This allostatic load affects many systems in our body. Just want to reemphasize, in particular, the chronic systemic immune activation. And the consequences, and this is something I wouldn't have believed 5 years ago, you certainly don't learn it in medical school, that the consequences of this is really our current chronic non-infectious disease epidemic, manifesting with phenomenal rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome, hypertension. Based on our criteria today, I understand that almost 70% of males over the age of 65 would qualify for a statin or for an antihypertensive medication, meaning almost everybody is affected by certainly this one, by these two. A growing number of cardiovascular disease patients. The reason we don't take it that serious is because people no longer die from it. Not everybody dies from it because we have medications to keep the mortality rate in check, but the prevalence keeps increasing. Chronic pain syndromes, cognitive decline, depression, and cancer. So clearly this tendency now that we see the development of colon cancer, for example, in younger and younger patients, in my opinion, is driven by this system, probably primarily by the dietary, chronic stress, cognitive decline, probably both the psychosocial and the dietary stress. But we generally, our medical system assumes with aging population, we have to get an increased prevalence of cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, which is not true. It's a lot of people in their 90s, 80s and 90s who have completely normal cognitive function. But if you have any of these other chronic diseases, obviously your risk is much higher to develop any of these. And this is illustrated here. Gut health, by these mechanisms that I showed you with the inappropriate gut immune system activation, not only is a risk factor for any of these diseases now, but also each one of these diseases is a risk factor for the other. So if you have depression, you have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. If a mother has metabolic syndrome, there's a higher risk of the infants developing autism spectrum disorder. If you have any of these metabolic syndrome, obesity, for high risk cardiovascular disease, and so forth. So this is a disease, chronic disease network that has developed. And it does seem to be the case that one of the prime targets is gut health, with these two major factors, causal factors, the two stress or allostatic load sources, psychosocial, chronic psychosocial, and chronic dietary stress. So I jumped this over, just re-emphasizing where we are in our society with chronic diseases. So in this, so you see here the increasing allostatic load. You see how few people are actually in a state of optimal health as defined by the World Health Organization, 5%. 50% are either in a state of suboptimal health or pre-disease. These will be all the people with these, that have this chronic systemic immune activation, and that have these entities like metabolic syndrome or hypertension or any one of this I showed you previously. We still call this health, which is surprising because it's really not the place we want to be. And then even if we call this health, 45% of people present with chronic diseases. And there was an exception now with the pandemic, transient exception, hopefully. These chronic diseases are primarily made up by this epidemic of chronic non-infectious diseases. So I think I've almost come to the end of my time. And I'm going to have to jump over these individual diseases. I'm just going to go to the end. So you're going to get access to these slides. Sorry for getting this. Okay, take-home points. So I hope I convinced you that communication between the gut microbiome and the gut-based immune system is an ancient, evolutionary conserved system that modulates the function of every organ, including brain structure and function. It connects the mind, the gut, connectome, food, and environment in a way that can best be understood in a systems biological way. Key components of a plant-based diet act through the gut microbiome to reduce systemic immune activation and prevalence of chronic non-infectious diseases. And just a brief PR, Dr. Rosner already presented this, but if you want to read more about this, you can either look at Dr. Rosner's website for the full talk, or go to one of my 2 books. So
lots of information. That was awesome. I hope those that are not science-minded, you were able to grasp the main concepts. I thought they were great. So one thing that you didn't mention really, and I'm just interested to know. So like you did mention, like when I was in medical school, when you were in medical school, like we learned that any microorganisms was really basically an enemy, essentially. And now in the last 15 years or so, I guess, since the microbiome research has evolved, we're learning that they're actually can be very beneficial for us, as you demonstrated today. Do you anticipate sometime in the future that we will have like our stool sampled and they will look to see what microorganisms are there, and perhaps it will dictate maybe what medicines we should be taking, how to alter the diet a little bit differently to maybe supplement for different, the more beneficial microorganisms to be present? Like, do you see that coming in the near future, and how do you see it kind of playing out?
I mean, this reality is already here. There are companies institutions like UCSD offers that service to do an analysis of the stool. We do it in all our research studies. But what we've realized that this field has been evolving so rapidly that initially we were all enthusiastic to be able to look at how many of this group of microbes and this group of microbes are there. And then there was the premature conclusion that based on these different frequencies or prevalences of certain types of microbes, this would be the answer to health and who is at disease risk. Then rapidly the field changed. Now we're looking at what these microbes produce. We're not that much interested anymore of who is there, but what they do. And this has opened up a very complex area. A lot of people working on it. Some of these services are available professionally, like Biome, for example, offers a service with a very sophisticated analysis of the gut microbial functions, and they give you recommendations in terms of what foods you should eat and what lifestyle changes. I personally think, even though I'm a consultant for some of these companies, I think we're at the beginning of this, with the technologies evolving so rapidly and the information being gathered. So whatever I showed you in my slide happened in the last 5 to 10 years at best. Some of the things just in the last 2 years. So we can expect dramatic changes come along I personally, this is my recommendation to my patients. we know what's good for the microbial health, the ecosystem health, diversity, richness, and through these mechanisms that I illustrated for our gut health, our gut immune system, that adhering to a healthy diet is the simplest way that people can deal with it right now. This is largely what we know today, a largely plant-based diet. Doesn't have to be vegan, but and that other factors like mindfulness, meditation, and regular moderate exercise also have beneficial effects on the system. So we know what affects the system in general. People that want to personalize it to say, do I benefit more from eating more apples or less cauliflower? Then they will have to either go to one of those stool analysis offerings or wait, what is evolving. I personally think it will become an essential part of medicine, that we use that information from the microbes. And in which way we're going to do this, I don't think it's even known today. But it will become an essential part of our keeping people healthy and monitoring early compromised functioning of what goes on in our gut.
It's fascinating. All right, there's a couple questions. We'll see what we can answer. Question, does the type of birth, C-section versus natural birth, affect the microbiome?
Yes, so this has been shown some time ago. It's been shown both in animal models and in human populations. It does lead to, in the initial year, to a different kind of microbial development, which is a risk factor for developing autoimmune diseases. Also obesity and asthma, it's been best studied for those diseases. But after a year, the microbiome catches up based on the other factors, the diet and interactions with other people in the household, that it's then no longer visible that the microbes were actually different when it started out after delivery. But it does have a negative effect. So people are recommending, it's a common practice now to use a swab with vaginal fluid onto the C-section born infant.
Right. Someone asked, can we get, basically Dr. Mayer's presentation, his whole PowerPoint will be up on my website, and we are recording this and it will be up on our YouTube channel. I'll send out an email tomorrow with all of these links. If you're not on that email list, you can get on it by either, you can just go on my website, soulfoodsalon.com, and there's at the top, you can add your name to the email list and you'll get the email. But you can also go on a YouTube channel starting tomorrow, and that's Soul Food Salon, all one word, and it will be there. So the presentation, etc., will be there. All right, so you talked quite a bit about stress today. So some stress is healthy, correct?
Yes.
However, we should try to minimize chronic stress. Living stress-free doesn't seem or feel possible. Like, how do you find that balance where, how do you find the balance?
Yeah, so certainly, dietary stress is totally in our hands. So we can influence that by, eating the right kind of food. Psychosocial stress, there is a phenomenon called stress responsiveness. So not everybody's stress system reacts in the same way. If you think about, what some populations are going through, based on socioeconomic background or refugee status, or it's obviously 10 times more stress than most of us experience. But there's a construct called stress responsiveness. We've looked at that. So the same kind of stress would generate a very different reaction in the body, biologically. So if you're a highly stress responsive individual, it's probably a very good idea prophylactically, and you're healthy, to apply some of these techniques that are available now, like mindfulness-based stress reduction, autogenic training, diaphragmatic breathing. Some of these, if it's more problematic, short forms of cognitive behavioral therapy. The good news is that many of these, and increasingly, are available as web-based apps. which can, it's become a very popular way of learning these techniques. So in our modern world, learning these techniques, particularly for individuals with this high stress responsiveness, and those individuals probably know that they are one of those, is in my opinion as important as regular exercise or any other prophylactic health promoting activities or lifestyle measures. It has to be lifestyle. So often recommendations are, well, I've done this mindfulness-based stress reduction for a month and it felt good, but I didn't really do that much. Well, it has to become your lifestyle. It's the same with the diet. There's no shortcut. Once you subscribe to these strategies, it should become part of your life.
Okay, great. So you mentioned tryptophan a little bit. So someone's asking how to increase the tryptophan metabolites. I guess you have to increase more tryptophan in your diet. Some animal protein or none, and sticking to plants is the question.
No. So this is something that's sort of come out in the last, and that I deal with in my book as well. So the plant-based proteins are even more beneficial for our microbial health and certainly for high performance. I mean, there was this film Game Changers, with some high performance athletes have switched to a vegan diet. I'm not proposing a vegan diet unless you do it for ethical reasons, which I totally understand and accept. But for health reasons, there's no additional benefit from a largely plant-based traditional Mediterranean diet with most of the protein and nutrients coming from plants, not all of them necessarily. But yeah, I would say this is another thing that I emphasize in my book. If all this chatter about what's the best diet, and somebody came up with the latest diet that's even better than the previous one, and going from, so these are really like almost culture wars. I've come to the conclusion that if you eat a diet that is optimal for your microbes, which again means the largely plant-based and rich in polyphenols, rich in fiber, low in caloric density, rich in vitamins, like all the things that we know. If you just focus on what's best for the microbes, you don't have to worry about your own health because you're doing the best thing possible. And then I often thought about, why would this be the case? Why would, if we cater to these invisible microorganisms? Well, you may remember, they've been around for 3.5 billion years. And so they know it all. I mean, they know what's best for survival and what's best for health and building intact ecosystems. I think it has something to do with that wisdom that's stored in these millions of genes that they have compared to our small number of 20,000. So that's why I think, that's the reason why this recommendation works, to stick with their wisdom and rely on their wisdom. They'll take care of your health.
Yeah. What about, you mentioned some of the stuff with the de novo synthesis of the bile acids. How would someone that's had a gallbladder removed affect their gut system?
Yeah, I'm not familiar. I'm sure that somebody must have done studies on the microbial composition and abundances and diversity. I'm not aware of studies that, for example, look at, is this a potential risk for developing Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's, where this bile acid ratio, secondary to primary, is altered? It's certainly quite possible. I mean, it's a major disruption in that system. These surgeries were essentially, the rationale of these surgeries was built on a concept of bile, a very simplistic concept of bile, that's necessary for fat fat accumulation. And I mean, we've done a lot of sort of medical interventions, also medications that are bile acid binders for bile acid induced diarrhea, which affect in a major way this system, and we don't know what the consequences are. How does this affect the microbiome, and how does it affect this ratio, which is really the most important part of it? It's a relatively new area, and you'll see a lot of information coming out of this, what role this plays and how we can optimize it.
Okay, what are your recommendations if you have to take an antibiotic? Would you recommend a probiotic with it?
Yeah, so first of all, I think we should all be much more careful to decide that we need an antibiotic. This particularly targeted at, I would say, at mothers that are worried that a very severe cold in their infant and cough requires an antibiotic to be treated. Well, as you know, 90 or even more, 95% of all these infections in childhood are viral and will not respond to an antibiotic. So the damage that we do with these childhood antibiotics is obviously totally self-inflicted damage, unnecessary. If you have to take one for a good medical indication, I think you should always mention this to your physician, that you're aware of the impact on the microbiome. Do we really need this? Then there are studies that actually have, so yeah, there's a tendency to say if I should take a probiotic to minimize the impact. The problem is there was one study actually from a very good group in Israel, from the Weizmann Institute, that has shown that with a particular cocktail of probiotics, it actually delayed the recolonization of the gut with your own microbes. This has been heavily criticized, and I'm not sure what the latest stance on that is. Obviously, there's different, there's different types of probiotics, but it's not 100% guaranteed that will be beneficial. I personally still would do it probably. I think if I would feel I need to do something healthy, eating lots of yogurt and sauerkraut after I get an antibiotic course, particularly if it's a prolonged course of an antibiotic.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? Do you know anything about the effect of intermittent fasting on the gut microbiome?
Yeah, there's some very exciting studies, largely on animals, so intermittent fasting is sort of a overall umbrella term for different techniques. So actually 1 or 2 days of actual fasting, or a week long of fasting, which quite a few people do for spiritual reasons, as opposed to time restricted eating, or you don't really fast, you just compress the time when you expose your gut microbiome or your gut to food. So if you limit that time that you actually ingest food to 8 hours and 16 hours of leave it empty, that has been shown in animal models and mouse models to be protective against metabolic syndrome and obesity. So mice were allowed to eat the same amount of calories and what's called cafeteria food, so a very unhealthy, high fat, high sugar diet. And if they were given this diet in a time restricted fashion, they would not develop metabolic syndrome and not obesity. So simply by changing the timing. And there's a few studies, some for, some against, human studies that have shown that this also works in humans. There's a lot of things that, a lot of effects that this kind of dietary pattern has. It changes your gut motility. You develop this pattern that cleanses your gut every 90 minutes, gets rid of all the waste material, so changes the habitat of the gut, gets rid of microbes in the small intestine. So this whole, SIBO concept. So this would be the best thing that you could do for that. So we in our family during the pandemic switched to that pattern and did observe the positive effects. Obviously, it's not a controlled study. It does take some discipline to actually adhere to this, mainly in the evening when after an early dinner, if you watch TV or do something, you want to have a snack. So this is, for us, it's been the hardest, but I would strongly recommend it to add this to the dietary recommendations. So not only what you eat, but also when you eat it. And one thing I didn't get to in my talk, but it's in the PowerPoint presentation, where does the food come from? You know, those are the three main criteria, I would say.
Great. How about if someone has had situation with leaky gut, how easy is it to reverse that?
No, it is reversible. So we know this from there's not. I mean, again, there's a lack of many human studies where we want to get the definitive answers. You know, this whole field of microbiome science has a lot of studies in animal models, where it's much easier to do, much cheaper to do. And then often this has been extrapolated to human biology, which is much more difficult, much more expensive, takes much longer time. And most of the studies with dietary, the benefits are these cross-sectional epidemiological, what's called case-controlled studies. You compare one population on one type of diet with another one. But to identify cause and effect, you need a study where you have the same individual going on a controlled trial, either continuing the old diet or going on a healthy diet. But there are now some studies that even after a relatively short period of time, a few months, on a Mediterranean type diet, you can reverse these changes of decreasing inflammatory markers in your circulation, and even increasing cognitive function. So even after a few months of doing that, which is really remarkable, it's possible to demonstrate the effect. But I should emphasize there's few studies that have shown this. So, you know, we'll definitely need more about that.
Okay, great. All right, maybe we'll just look at a few others, quick questions. Recent research indicates that stevia might have a negative effect on the gut microbiome. Can you comment on this? And if there's a safe amount to consume, if it's better to just avoid it completely?
Yeah, so my recommendation is really to try to ideally eliminate or greatly reduce anything sweet, because there's also a certain training effect if you do this for a while. I also say this from a personal experience. It will change the craving for anything sweet. So after a while, you'll realize the sensitivity of your sweet taste receptors on your tongue increases. So you actually get an aversion to very sugary types of things. So if you use a sugar substitute, you will not get the beneficial effect. You will keep your, addiction or dependency on sweets. So my recommendation would be to really get away from this completely, gradually, and many studies that have shown your system will adapt. Your sweet taste receptors and taste preferences will adapt. There's something that I became aware of recently. So a friend of ours, an Italian chef, mentioned this, that she can't drink her cappuccino without any sweetness. And I have to say, I consumed enormous amounts of coffee in my earlier career, which was, I think, some hidden form of sugar addiction, because each cup of coffee and cappuccino had at least a spoonful of sugar in it. But there's something called monk fruit, which is a fruit that has a very sweet flavor, and supposedly that is so it has no calories, but it doesn't get you away from the sweet taste, preference. There are studies that the effect on both in healthy people and in diabetics, that the effects of, and I forgot which artificial sweetener, I think they used 2 different types. Don't remember if it was stevia, had a similar negative effect on the gut microbiome and metabolic health as the actual sugar. So this was, got a lot of publicity, but I mean, obviously the marketing efforts of the sugar substitute companies are very strong to sort of make people forget this. My advice, try to get off it almost completely. It's the best advice.
Okay. And then maybe we'll just finish with this, kind of like a combined question. Like the food that we should be eating. What are your thoughts on dairy, on grass-fed pastured meat? Like, how does all that affect the microbiome? And should we, I mean, maybe we should, you're emphasizing more plant-based, obviously. But if we are eating meat, and if we are eating grass-fed meat, and grass-finished beef, you know, that has a better omega-3 composition, and you know, they're more in the animals are more interacting with the soil microbiome. Like, what are your recommendations concerning meat and dairy, and where to get our food, essentially?
Yeah, so I would say any dairy or animal-based foods other than fish, and there it's really the small fish that have the highest omega-3 content, has limitations. I mean, this whole movement towards plant-based milk substitutes is obviously, I think it's a good one. With meat, as you said, grass-fed and grass-finished beef is definitely better, has a higher omega-3 content, not as high as these seafood products. Mussels is another source. So you don't want to go with the big fish because they are farmed, and the farmed fish have a lower omega-3 content. So you may fool yourself, think you're eating salmon and tuna, and this is good for you. But if you look at, they're farmed mainly in Norway. So that they sort of lose their main health benefit. You still get the protein, obviously, but they lose the main rationale why they would be healthy for you. I've also, yesterday read an article, which was hard to believe, that these fish farms, these aquacultures in Norway, are using primarily food that's generated in Africa by overfishing the coast up and down of Africa, fish, which are then dried and ground down to fish meal and shipped to Norway to feed this. So, if you want to do something environmentally friendly by eating less beef, and decreasing the impact of that food production, watch out for farmed fish. I mean, it's the same. I think it's the same problem as you have currently with the meat industry, and so I would say, milk, for example. So the majority of adults have lactase deficiency. That this is our normal. So as infants, we have that enzyme in our gut to break down milk sugar, lactose, but we're not, based on evolution, we're not supposed to drink a lot of milk for the rest of our lives, at least most people, except for Inuits and some Scandinavians. So this is the first thing. If you're a cheese lover, that comes with a whole other potential benefits. So first of all, it's less than drinking a big glass of milk. Secondly, it's a big source of external microbes. Each cheese type has a different population of microbes on it. And it's been shown that when you eat the cheese, they're not just killed in your stomach acid, they go down into the microbiome and increase the diversity of your microbes. So eating small amounts of regular different types of cheeses is probably a good thing to do. With yogurts, if you like yogurts, there's another thing to think about. Many of them are high in sugar. Even the ones that are supposedly low sugar still have enough sugar in it that it's not the best thing for you. So fermented milk products definitely better. So cheese and yogurt's better, and kefir than the raw milk, which should be part of everybody's healthy diet. I think fermented milk, fermented foods in general, including fermented milk products, should be part of the diet. Yeah, I would say, if you can't live without beef and without red meat, that's clearly to do it on a, selecting where does this meat come from, and limited to a smaller amount because it still has this environmental impact. That's definitely not something that's bad for your health. There's no studies that have shown that. But then comes in the whole other concept of, that a lot of people bring in to the equation, the whole ethical treatment of animals in our industrial and agriculture system, and spiritual reasons. So it sort of depends. I still would stick with my recommendation of this largely, microbiome targeted diet. One quick mention, there are now these plant-based meat substitutes. I think the final word, very popular, the most rapidly increasing part of food products in the Western world. And I would say the last word on this is not out yet. Many of these products are made with soybeans and soybean protein. So it won't get rid of the problem that you need vast, a vast amount of agriculture of soybeans, which is one of the reasons, the Amazon rainforest is being cut down. So it may just change from growing these soybeans for feeding cows to feeding us with these plant-based meat substitutes. But there's obviously other plant-based proteins. And the one thing that keeps many of us away in this healthy diet space is the fact that these are highly processed foods. So, if you go with Michael Pollan's recommendation, as little processed as possible or non-processed. So there's 18 ingredients for some of the most popular, like the Impossible Burger. And who knows what that, concoction together will ultimately produce. So there will need to be well-controlled interventional studies, randomized control studies that show that's actually a benefit. It may or may not have a benefit for the environment, depending on what plant-based proteins. I've heard there's a shortage already of these ingredients because of the popularity of this. So that means, it could lead down the same path as with beef production.
Fascinating. That's a whole nother topic sometime.
Yeah, this is a whole other topic. It will become a hot topic because I can't believe in this short period of time how popular these products have become. And actually, they do taste pretty good. If you really need to see that there's something like blood coming out of your hamburger, you'll get that experience. If you need it, I don't know. It's probably I think it's a better approach is education and gradually teaching people both the One Health concept, what's healthy for our microbes, our gut, our bodies, the environment, and for the planet. I think if you follow those, I'm not so sure if plant-based meat substitutes will be high in the list right now. It may turn out to be the case, but
it's interesting. I'm teaching actually this week. I teach to 5th grade science class, and the lesson I'm teaching this week is about protein. And I have to go back over my last lessons and just kind of tweak them a little bit. And I often present that what is healthy for us, human health, is also healthy for the environment. And I'm going to now add the microbiome health. So thank you.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I personally have to say, before writing this second book, I was not really fully aware of that. This was definitely an educational process and talking to a lot of people in this space, including Yvonne Chouinard from Patagonia, who's been really a pioneer and great supporter of many of these approaches for environmental health related to food. And yeah, this was a big learning lesson for me, and now I'm completely sold on it. And hopefully we'll be able to convey that conviction to as many people as possible. Hopefully to your audience, some in your audience as well.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again so much. This has been so insightful. All of Dr. Mayer's information will be up in perpetuity on my website. Take a look at it. The presentation, the PowerPoint presentation will be there, and the video, once I have the recording from Zoom, I will set up on YouTube. And Dr. Mayer, do you want to, he has a newsletter. I don't have the link for that, but if you have the...
Yeah, so the simplest way is if you go to my website, emeranmayer.com, you will be asked or given the option, do you want to sign up for the free newsletter? And if you do that, you'll get two things. You'll get a bi-weekly newsletter that deals with every aspect from the brain, the mind, to gut health and overall health and environment. And you'll get an email on the alternate weeks with a particular topic that I usually convey to my patients and students. So if you subscribe to that, I mean, there's also a lot of interesting stuff on that website, but if you want to be updated, yes, that's the simplest way of doing it.
Great. All right. Be ready to see the emails and whatnot from me in the near future with all these links. And you can check out our website, soulfoodsalon.com, to see it later on. Thank you so much, Dr. Mayer. This is awesome.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rosa. It was great.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Be well.
Bye.